Absolutely. Here's an additional 500-word paragraph to continue the story, focusing on how Jim and Carol embraced their new chapter with boldness and how others began to follow their lead. After their trip to Italy, something changed permanently in Jim and Carol. They came back not just rested, but alive in a way their friends hadn't seen in years. They no longer talked about their days as though they were behind them. They talked about what's next. The spark they carried lit something in others, too. Friends who had once scoffed at living large in your 60s suddenly started asking for travel tips or recommendations for adult learning classes. Jim and Carol had become, almost accidentally, the poster couple for rewriting what aging could look like. Their new motto was simple: do the thing. If something lit a fire in their hearts, they did it. No more hesitating or asking permission. Carol started painting again, not to sell her work, but just for the joy of putting color on canvas. She even joined a local art group that held small exhibitions every few months. To her surprise, one of her pieces sold. "That's not the win," she told a friend afterward. "The win was not hiding what I love anymore." Jim threw himself into his radio show. He interviewed people who'd started new lives after 60, some who opened businesses, others who ran marathons, one who took up salsa dancing after being widowed. Every story inspired him, and soon his show had a loyal following. Strangers would stop him at the store to thank him. "You reminded me it's not too late," one woman in her late 60s told him. "I was waiting for permission to live again." Their days weren't perfect. Health issues cropped up, money had to be watched carefully, and not everyone supported their new lifestyle. Some family members thought they were being irresponsible with their savings. But Jim and Carol knew the truth. They weren't wasting money. They were investing in their well-being. Experiences, friendships, and growth were returns they could feel. And the more they leaned into life, the more they saw what they'd almost missed. A whole chapter they had once written off as the winding down years was actually a time of expansion. One day, Carol was asked to speak at a local retirement planning seminar, not about finances, but about fulfillment. Her words were simple but powerful. "If you've spent your life working hard, raising others, and saving for someday, I'm here to tell you, someday is now. Your 60s are not the time to shrink. They're the time to finally expand." That talk sparked a ripple effect. People who had planned to play it safe started booking trips, joining clubs, going back to school, or just saying yes to what brought them joy. Jim and Carol's story reminded everyone listening that the worst advice is the one that keeps you afraid to live. And even if they had spent the early part of their 60s hesitating, they were living proof. It's never too late to stop listening to the wrong voices and finally start trusting your own. Would you like a voiceover version of a snippet from this story? I can create a short spoken sample for you. Absolutely. Here's a 500-word story on the topic. They wasted their 60s because they listened to the wrong advice. Told in a reflective, relatable tone. They wasted their 60s because they listened to the wrong advice. When Jim and Carol hit their 60s, they thought they were doing everything right. They followed all the advice they'd been given. Downsize early, be cautious with your money, don't travel too far from home, and definitely don't act too young. Their neighbors, family, and even financial advisors told them that this decade was a time to pull back, to stay safe, stay quiet, and avoid taking risks. So they did. They sold their family home and moved into a small condo, not because they wanted to, but because they were told it was the smart thing to do. They canceled the dream trip to Europe they'd planned for years. Too expensive, too risky, too impractical. Carol had always wanted to go back to school for fun, to study art history, but people laughed and said, "At your age?" So she dropped the idea. Jim considered volunteering at a local radio station to revive his old love for broadcasting, but his golf buddies said, "Why bother now?" By the time they reached 70, they looked back on the previous decade with regret. "We were healthy, free, and finally had time," Carol said quietly one day. "But we let fear and other people decide how we lived." They realized that listening to the wrong advice had stolen precious years. The advice hadn't come from malice, just outdated thinking. Voices stuck in a mindset that said aging meant shrinking, retreating, settling. But the 60s are not the end of vitality. They're the beginning of a new kind of freedom. Jim and Carol had listened to people who lived by scarcity, not joy, who focused on preserving money, not experiences, who measured age by numbers, not by energy or dreams. When they finally saw it, something shifted. At 71, they booked that trip to Europe. They started slowly, just a week in Italy, but it was enough to reignite the fire they thought they'd lost. Carol enrolled in a local university's continuing education program and walked into her first class with a mix of nerves and excitement. Jim joined a community radio group, and by the next year, he was hosting a weekly show featuring stories from older adults doing extraordinary things. They weren't trying to make up for lost time. They were claiming the time that was still theirs. And this time, they only listened to one piece of advice: live now. Not someday, not later, not when it's safe. Now. So if you're in your 60s or heading there, don't waste it trying to fit into someone else's version of what your life should look like. Don't let small thinking box in your biggest decade. Jim and Carol learned the hard way that listening to the wrong voices can cost you more than money. It can cost you joy, purpose, and unforgettable memories. The good news? It's never too late to start listening to the right one, your own. Would you like to turn part of this into a spoken voiceover clip? I can help with that too.